An elementary school kindergarten kid wouldn't come up with something as off the chart as that. But we have serious politicians pandering to the political notion that we have a serious problem at our borders. Actually, we do. If you talk to corporate executives, as I do, the biggest problem for the last 6 months, guess what? It's called, ready? Labor shortage. Gee, you know how we're going to solve that? By bringing in immigrants, which is what they want. They don't know how to do it politically yet. They're working on that. But the politicians still have the upper hand. It's a wonderful way to pander to a desperate political mass. Elect me and I will build a wall so they can't come in. What? What? That's so nonsensical. By the way, it never works. But besides that, it's nonsensical. It just shows you. Or to be angry at black and brown people, as if they're your problem. What are you doing? What is this craziness? You're desperate. I understand that. You've been suffering. You have. You have a right to be angry and upset. No question. You do. You have been screwed in this system, having been led to believe by those 100 years that the opposite was waiting in store for you. Instead, you're being slapped and whacked and deprived with no end in sight. I teach at the university. I'm surrounded all the time with people in 18, 19, into their 20s. They are not happy, this generation. They don't see good jobs. They don't see good futures. They don't see any of it. They were led by their parents and this culture to expect what they now know they're not going to get. And they want some answers too. The most recent Gallup poll indicates that a majority of Americans polled randomly, 35 years of age and younger, when asked, would you rather live in a capitalist or a socialist economy, the majority say socialist. You know, after half a century of ideological pressure against everything social that I grew up in, I'm a product of that. This is amazing that the points of view could be twisted like this. And when you talk to students, as I do about this all the time, I quickly learn this, the ballot, the polling is correct. But it's not that they like socialism, they haven't a clue what it is. Those votes, that polling, is because they are angry at capitalism. They know that that system is not for them. Socialism, I mean, let's try that. But it's not that they like socialism. It's that they don't like capitalism. But that has to be faced. I'm not making these numbers up. You can't come away from what I've just said with an imagination that all is well in this empire. But I'm not done. I'm not done. The level of political battle in this country is fierce. Republicans and Democrats attack each other. Literally. January 6th of last year, it was physical. They wanted to kill Nancy Pelosi or Mike Pence or whoever they got in their confused mind pegged as the enemy, the scapegoat, the one who did bad. Now we're blaming Russia. What? What? Russia invaded. I've been a victim of war in my own family, in my own life. I'm against war. War's no way to solve problems. The Russians shouldn't, could have done something else, should have done something else. I get that. But like with every war, you have to ask, why did it come to this? Russians have suffered from war as much as any other country in the last century. They're not going to go into a war easily and quickly. They're not like the United States, upon which no war has been fought in the last century. Both world wars killed more Russians than anybody else. They know. They know. So why? You have to ask, why? We don't. You know what we do? We demonize Mr. Putin. I don't like Mr. Putin either, but what? You know, we demonize Saddam Hussein. We demonize. That's very American. The other guy, the guy you're fighting, is the total sum of all evil in the world, whereas you are beautiful vanilla. What? Are we really that childish as a people that we can't ask the question, what happened here? Why did it come to this? You know, throughout the whole time of the Soviet Union, when we were told we were in a great struggle between capitalism and socialism, we didn't have a war between those two countries. Now we have a war with, when did it happen? After Russia stopped being socialist, went back to capitalism, and now we have war. You know what the big wars in World War I and II were? They were among capitalist countries. Was the whole story about capitalism and socialism just that? A story? Is war one of the gains we get from pushing socialism out of Russia? Those are real questions, but of course we can't answer them because we're fighting evil. We're fighting evil. The Russians commit war crimes. I don't doubt that they do. And the Ukrainians, they don't? Stop. No one is that foolish, but the American people get told these stories, and they add up. So let me end with military. Since the end of World War II, the United States has invaded small countries repeatedly, violating norms, rules-based international order. It invaded Korea. It invaded Vietnam. It invaded Iraq. It invaded Afghanistan. It lost all of them. The wars were lost. Korea, Vietnam, they all were lost. The Communist Party of Vietnam took over that country. The Taliban took over Afghanistan. I could go on. They lost. They didn't win. They lost. And if you look at the line between the Russians and the Ukrainians, it has moved westward relentlessly for the entire year of this war. There is no question of who's winning and who's losing. Only in the minds of people committed to denial are these things going on. I'm not asking you to endorse either side in this war. I'm not asking you to endorse China or the Chinese system. I'm just asking you, and I do this with all my public speaking, I'm asking you, look at the reality you have in front of you. Don't be afraid. The danger lies in denial, not in facing it. And if we face it, there is a lesson to be learned from the British Empire. After 2 attempts to militarily force the United States back into the British Empire, after those 2 efforts had failed, the British Empire stopped trying and decided instead to try to work out a relationship with the United States, which it did. Not the greatest job, but did a pretty good job. The biggest waffle came in the U.S. Civil War when the British seriously considered siding with the South. They didn't, but they came close. After that, though, once they could see who won there, they went with the winner. A very courageous move once the war was over. But maybe we have to learn that we have to live with the People's Republic of China. It has virtues. We can learn from them, just as they could learn from the United States. And that would be a better plan than what they're doing now. The American Seventh Fleet is in the China Sea. There is no Chinese fleet on our border. We are there. We are there. We are threatening them. We always have. This is a country that is now our economic competitor. Its global political reach is extraordinary. And it has 4 times the number of people we do. And now that they're closely allied with India, you're talking about the 2 largest countries by population on this planet. You better come to terms with them, because the prospect of defeating that in a war, that's a war everybody loses. So you don't have that option, unless you're crazy. Denial is never a good idea. Among psychologists, here's a truism. We all suffer traumas, particularly when we're young, children. And a trauma is bad. But a trauma that's denied, a trauma that can't be spoken, a trauma that can't be discussed, is always much worse. You figure that out as you get older, and maybe you can go and have a therapist help you return to that trauma, to do the work of working through it that you couldn't or didn't do when you were younger. That's the premise of much of modern psychotherapy. But it applies here too. We have to stop the denial and face what is going on. Otherwise, we are going to get ourselves into one mess after another. And who's going to do it? The corporations that are profiting from this system? Unlikely. The rich who have become richer for 40 years, are they likely to question a system that has rewarded them that way? Unlikely. You know who's going to do it, if anybody does? It's the mass of the people, the employees of this culture. Or, if you allow me the old language, the working class. Because it's their ass that's on the line. They're the soldiers, and they're the taxpayers who keep the system going. And that's probably why denial has won over honest confrontation with our reality. Marx once said that the capitalist class will in the end destroy itself. The question for all of us and all of you is, will we let that system take us down with it? Thank you. I've used up my time. I hope you have found it of interest.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Great Ideas Debate, co-hosted by the Abigail Adams Institute and the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. My name is Danilo Petranovich, and I work at the Abigail Adams Institute. Today, I will be your moderator. Abigail Adams Institute is an independent scholarly institute located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our mission is to offer students at Harvard and in the wider greater Boston area access to some of the most important subjects, themes, and arguments that can be found in the big books that define or perhaps used to define Western tradition. Before we begin today, I would like to express appreciation, first of all, to our friends at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for partnering with us to put on today's event. Thank you to Diana Davis Spencer Foundation for providing funds for this event. I'd also like to thank Mr. James Davenport of ISI and Mr. James Capuzzi of AAI for their leadership in pulling this event together. And finally, we're deeply grateful to Professors Brooks and Wolf for accepting our invitation. Sometime in the middle of the last decade, we have begun to see consistent data indicating that a striking number of young Americans, and especially young Democrats, say that they are more in favor of socialism than capitalism. What young people mean by socialism, or for that matter, capitalism, seems to be unclear and inexact, but it nevertheless indicates that dissatisfaction with the contemporary state of economic and social affairs. Our purpose today is to dig a little deeper and look behind these almost totemic terms in order to try to better understand the history and philosophy entailed by these isms. Our hope is that our two distinguished interlocutors will help us to get to a more constructive place after these next 90 or so minutes. So, to advance that mission, we have framed the resolution in following terms. Resolve that socialism is preferable to capitalism as an economic system that promotes freedom, equality, and prosperity. The format of the debate is as follows. The first speaker will open for between 15 and 20 minutes. After the second speaker does the same, the first speaker will take no more than 10 minutes to respond and perhaps use this time to pose a direct question to the other speaker. The second speaker will then do the same. We will then go into the second stage of the debate where I will pose select audience questions to the debaters. This will go on for about 30 minutes, and the entire event should last somewhere between 90 and 100 minutes. Students can comment in the chat function that you will see on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can submit questions by clicking on the Q&A tab, also there. And I promise to do my best to get to the best questions before this is over. I will now briefly introduce our debaters. Arthur C. Brooks is the William Henry Bloomberg Professor of the Practice of Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School and Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School. Before joining the Harvard faculty in July of 2019, he served for 10 years as president of the American Enterprise Institute, a public policy think tank in Washington. Brooks is the author of 11 books, including the national bestsellers Love Your Enemies, The Conservative Heart, and The Road to Freedom. He's a columnist for The Atlantic, host of the podcast The Art of Happiness with Arthur Brooks, and subject of the 2019 documentary film The Pursuit. In full disclosure, Professor Brooks is a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute. Richard D. Wolf is professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's currently a visiting professor at the graduate program in international affairs at the New School University in New York City. His recent publications include Contending Economic Theories, Neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian, with S. Resnick, and The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That's most recent, 2020. Professor Wolf has also taught economics at Yale University, the City College of the City University of New York, and the Sorbonne in Paris. Professor Wolf's weekly show, Economic Update with Richard D. Wolf, is syndicated on over 70 radio stations nationwide and available for broadcast on Free Speech TV, among other networks. In full disclosure, Professor Wolf is Harvard College, class of 1963. Professor Wolf will go first and will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. And Professor, it's all yours.
First of all, thank you to all who worked on producing this event and inviting me to be part of it. I am flattered and pleased that you are open to this kind of a conversation because we are all aware that for most of the last 75 years, during that period, rightly called the Cold War, this kind of conversation would have been, if not impossible, extremely rare. I'll try to speak quickly. I have a lot of material to cover, and I hope that it will be comprehensive. I've tried to organize my thoughts that way. So let me introduce it. There are three parts: an introduction, the socialist critique of capitalism, and then what it is that the socialists, in my judgment, offer. I obviously take the affirmative position on the resolution as it was read. So here's first the introduction. Every economic system in the history of the world that I'm aware of displays the following form. It is born, it evolves over time, and then it dies or passes away. Tribal economies, feudalism, slavery, whatever you look at, conforms more or less to that pattern, although it sometimes can be repeated at different moments in history. I see no reason whatsoever to imagine that capitalism will not share this basic form. And since I know that capitalism was born, and I know that it has evolved, at least since the 17th century, when it began in England in its modern form, it would seem to me reasonable to assume that the next stage for capitalism is its passing away, and that the logical inference is what we have to talk about is how close to that process we might now be. All systems are also similar in having generated, as far as we can tell, both those who celebrated it and those who criticized it. There's nothing unique or distinctive about capitalism in doing that. From the very beginning of capitalism, whenever you designate its origins, there were the people who loved it and the people who criticized it and didn't like it. People who thought it was the ultimate achievement of the human possibility, and those who were convinced we can and we should do better. Socialism is the most developed critical tradition in relationship to capitalism. It has constantly evolved and developed. It keeps recurring despite horrendous repressions, attacks, dismissals of all kinds. It's clear to me that capitalism's flaws and failures are the basic stimulus to which socialism is the response. It's as if socialism were capitalism's shadow. Nothing guarantees the future of socialism so well and so clearly as the continuation, if you like, of capitalism, to which it is a response. Capitalism spread from its 17th century origins in England to Western Europe and then eventually to the whole world. So did socialism. It exists now in every country on this planet, in a variety of forms in every country on this planet. In the last 150 years, roughly, that it has been a formal tradition. It demonstrates a spread that few other tendencies or traditions of human thought and practice have achieved. It is, in short, stunning. However, it is also the case that having spread in historically a short amount of time to societies at such different levels of economic, political, and cultural development, that the tradition is diverse and rich. The different cultures have interpreted the ideas of socialism in their own unique ways, reflecting where they were in their own development. The result is that socialism is a complicated tradition of multiple theories and theoretical movements, sometimes clashing, sometimes together. The most famous and most developed within the socialist tradition is that which takes the name of Marx and Marxism, and it has a parallel history to socialism, and that has to be understood as part of the richness and diversity. The tendency to think of socialism in the singular, as if it were some body of thought that can be reduced to one train of argument, is wrong. It's a kind of simple-mindedness that comes really in our country out of the Cold War. When the bad guys were over there in Russia and we were the good guys, they were bad in their five different dimensions, and we were good in those same dimensions. This kind of mentality is now fading, none too soon for most of us, and I hope that's a view shared by others today. Having said all that, let me turn then to number two, what socialism's critique of capitalism are. And here I'm trying to condense the very different arguments of different groups of people into a few basics so that we can talk in the singular only after I have made clear that it's not the case that socialism is a family, if you like, a tradition of diverse points of view. So here we go with some of the basics. The critique of capitalism carries the notion that capitalism, in Europe at least, emerges out of feudalism, making some promises. That is, the leaders of the transition out of feudalism, out of the monarchies that were typical of feudalism, particularly in its later centuries, etc., that those leaders, whether they were Robespierre in France or Jefferson in the United States or anyone else you want to pick, they made some promises that the transition from a feudal economic system to a capitalist system would bring, and I'll use the French words, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And the Americans might have been thought to have added democracy. The French and American revolutions were full of affirmations that these wonderful benefits would come with, would be delivered by a transition from a feudal economy, lords and serfs, to a capitalist economy. And the argument of socialism has always been that capitalism failed to deliver on those promises. It never has, and there's no prospect that it will. Number two, that capitalism has a built-in tendency to produce ever deepening inequality of income and wealth. The book by Thomas Piketty a few years ago makes this point over and over again, as do the flow of researchers coming from Piketty and Saez out of the University of California in Berkeley and out of Paris. Occasionally, when this inequality goes too far, there are popular revolts against it. Then, temporarily, it can be stopped or even sometimes reversed. But it's only temporary. Once the capitalists regain their position, say after the Great Depression of the 1930s, the inequality resumes deepening, and we have a wonderful example of that in the last 40 years here in the United States. Beyond inequality, capitalism is also, in the socialist view, fundamentally unstable. On the average, every 4 to 7 years, as the National Bureau of Economic Research has shown us, it has a downturn. Some of them are short and shallow, others of them are long and deep. Every 47 years, on average, wherever capitalism has settled, this is the pattern. We have had three in the 21st century, the one in 2000, so-called dot-com, the one in 2008, so-called prime mortgage, subprime mortgage, excuse me, and now this one. Each one gets a label to distract from the fact that it's built into capitalism, so we call it by whatever happens together with it, as in, for example, the COVID crash. But it is a feature of capitalism that they have tried, the capitalists and their supporters, to overcome, to stop them, to control them. Never has worked. We continue to have them. We're living in one right now. And finally, it's a very undemocratic system. This is perhaps the most important for this audience. And the lack of democracy is located in a particular place, the place that distinguishes capitalism from other systems. The arrangement in production of an employer and an employee. The employer, the owner, the operator, if it's corporate, it's a board of directors, 10 to 15, 20 people. They have the power. They decide what will be produced, how it will be produced, where it will be produced, and what is done with the profits that the work of everybody helped to produce. They are not accountable to the vast majority of the people in an enterprise whom we call employees. It is a fundamentally undemocratic way of organizing factories, offices, and stores. It is the opposite of democracy. The very accountability we take pride in politically has never been introduced into our economic system, and that's capitalism's commitment to an undemocratic organization of its enterprises. Therefore, what has socialism done? Well, socialism has been busy over the last 100 years making experiments, trying in different ways, depending on which tradition within socialism is in a position to do so, to establish what comes next, what happens when capitalism blows itself up. And those experiments are very similar to the experiments made in Italian city states, in the Low Countries, in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. That transition also took a lot of experiments, some of which didn't work out real well, but they slowly taught people interested in that tradition what to do and what not to do until they finally got it right and capitalism could become the dominant system. And so we have three traditions of socialism to summarize. One, the most moderate one, often called democratic socialism, a la Bernie Sanders or AOC, or in Europe, social democracy. Here we have private capitalist enterprises, but with heavy government controls, taxes, minimum wages, health insurance, free schooling. It's called capitalism with a human face in Europe, where they can have some humor about these subjects. It's Western Europe, it's Scandinavia. The second kind of socialism happened when the socialism I just described split. That was around the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And a group of socialists went off, changed their name, called themselves communists, and took all of this another step. The government wouldn't just regulate private capitalists, it would replace them. Government officials would own and operate enterprises, not all of them, almost never all of them, but more or less important parts of them. And then there were reactions of socialists to these first two experiments, mainly Russia, mainly China. And the reaction was to come up with another kind of socialism, which focused not on the state, arguing that the focus on the state was misplaced, not the proper target, not an important matter how much is private and how much is state, at least not as important as a different matter, which is dealing with that undemocratic organization of capitalist enterprises. This socialism focuses on the micro level, not the macro level. On the micro level, the argument is simple. Democratize the enterprise. Make the enterprise a democratic location or site in society. Everybody who works in the enterprise, one person, one vote. It's decided democratically by majority vote what will be produced, what technology will be used, what location for the production will be, and what is done with the net revenues, surplus, or profit. Take your pick. In this perspective,
video got
the
four, I think,
fundamental flaws of
maybe
capitalism,
2, 4
its inequality,
views on
its
it. It's unbelievable.
instability, are linked and derivative from its undemocratic internal organization. If you have a tiny group of people at the top making all the key decisions, then it isn't surprising that they give to themselves a disproportionate share of whatever the profits or net revenues happen to be. And they become very wealthy relative to the employees, as we certainly can see. And they make their animal spirit decisions about whether to invest or not, facing irreducible uncertainty and the need to guess about the future, focused on profits. And they make profits the bottom line because, of course, they're the ones who get them. And that's what an enterprise should be doing if it's going to serve, first and foremost, those, the minority, who sit at the top. So the socialism of the 21st century, I would argue, is not going to be what it was in the 20th, but rather a new kind of socialism with a focus on the transformation of the enterprise as a learned lesson from what went well and what went not well in the earlier experiments. And I believe that in this country, the growing interest in socialism, to which I will be glad to speak since I'm part of it, is a remarkable testimony to the relevance and to the bright future that this perspective has. I think it will become more and more popular because, in the words of the resolution, it's a better road forward and a way to transition from a declining capitalism to a response to the yearning all good people have to do better in the future than we have been able to do in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wolf, for the opening remarks. Professor Brooks.
Thank you, Danilo, and thank you, Professor Wolf. I've known Professor Wolf's work for a long time, and I want to take the first 30 seconds of my time to recommend his writings to all of you who are watching, for those of you who are not familiar with his work. And the reason is basically this. A lot of people, particularly those who are on the political right, they're used to a sharp and harsh discourse from the political left of late that is based in fear, not in love. Professor Wolf's work is based on love, not in fear. His objective is entirely to lift people up, people who are vulnerable, people at the margins of society, people who do not have power. I think that is incredibly important and in stark contrast to the way that we've undertaken political and economic discourse of late, to build up, not to tear down. So for those of you who are watching, who consider yourselves to be the political left, please emulate the kinds of arguments and the philosophy of Professor Wolf. And for those of you who are on the political right, I'd like you to join me in admiring the way that he argues, and in point of fact, the way that his mind works around these topics. My viewpoints are morally in line with Professor Wolf's, but they are practically very different. So the tenor of my remarks will be based on my answer to the resolution, which is that capitalism is superior to socialism, but it must be based in proper morals. I remember the first time that I saw the face of actual world poverty. I was a child. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, in a lower middle class family. And I saw a picture in the National Geographic magazine in the early 1970s when I was a child of a starving boy in Ethiopia. It was very common at the time. The national and international press was starting to show the images of a horrible famine in East Africa, the worst that anybody had ever imagined, as a matter of fact, although I'm sure that had been worse in history. And the boy had a distended belly and flies on his face, and he was starving, and there was nothing I could do. There was nothing that we thought any of us could do. Those images were haunting to an entire generation of Americans, that and people all over the world of good faith, that there was not just inequality, there was a grinding sense of injustice about what was going on. And there was nothing we could do. Something was wrong with our economy, something was wrong with our entire system. Well, I grew up with that image, and occasionally I would wonder what happened to that boy as I, went along my own merry way as an American through my 20s, and I was not an economist. I was not paying attention to worldwide economic trends. I was making my living through my 20s as a musician, and if you'd asked me my political point of view, was I closer to socialism or capitalism, I would say most definitely socialism. Most definitely. Because it does have a human face. Now, I didn't have the sophistication that Richard just brought to this debate. I mean, I was a French horn player after all, and you hold me to very high economic standards under those circumstances. But it gives you an idea of my ideology. Well, in my late 20s, still a musician, I happened across a statistic that I could hardly believe, which is that from the time that I had seen that photograph of that boy in Africa until I was about 30 years old, the world population living on $1 a day or less, obviously adjusted for inflation, had decreased by 80%. 4/5 of starvation level poverty had been eliminated in my lifetime, since when I was a little kid until I had grown up. And I thought to myself, I need to get to the bottom of this. And I started studying economics. I literally changed professions from classical music to economics, from the sublime to the dismal, because of this statistic, what it was revealing to me. Meanwhile, life expectancy had gone up by 15%, infant mortality had gone down by 60%, adult literacy had gone up by 23% in my lifetime. What did that? What actually created the miracle that pulled 2 billion of my sisters and brothers around the world out of poverty? And I didn't even know it. By the way, 70% of Americans will tell you today that poverty and hunger has gotten worse in our lifetime. What did it? I went for solutions. And again, my predilection was to find out that it was something like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or some set of institutions that had relieved world poverty on a massive scale. And I looked at the work of economists at the World Bank and economists that I deeply came to admire, like the Spanish economist Xavier Salé Martin, development economists. And they are of a mind that there were 5 forces that did this. 5, and this is the consensus opinion. They are globalization, property rights, the rule of law, free trade, and a culture of free enterprise emanating from the United States and spreading around the world. Now, you might ask yourself, what has this actually done to the rich versus the poor? What has it done about inequality? And the answer is inequality has unambiguously improved over this period. It's true that the rich have gotten richer in raw money income in the United States, especially of late. But around the world, global income inequality has decreased almost every year for 50 years and has plummeted over the past 25 years. This is not a story that you get in the press, but it is in point of fact true that notwithstanding what capitalism has done for the richest people in the world, it has done much, much more for the people at the bottom. My first lesson was that global free enterprise has indisputably been beneficial for the world's poorest people. But it has also had costs. Let's not kid ourselves. There's a town in Kentucky, in Martin County, in eastern Kentucky, called Inez, Kentucky. It's a famous place, not because there's something going on there particularly, but because that's where Lyndon B. Johnson, President Johnson, kicked off his famous war on poverty one day before I was born in 1964. He went to Inez, Kentucky, and he walked up on he was the master of PR. I mean, he put President Obama and President Trump to shame how well he worked with the press. He went up on the porch of a man named Tommy Fletcher who lived in a tar paper shack, and he said, "I have called for a national war on poverty. Our objective is total victory." Now, this town, Inez, Kentucky, was one of the poorest places in the United States. People were literally starving to death. No running water, no electricity. He came back to Washington, D.C. He put a great American named Sergeant Shriver in charge of the war on poverty, who said, "We are investing in dignity, not doles." You would cheer if you heard this. He was a great man, a patriot. Well, what ensued was the most frustrating war ever. You think that there was a quagmire in Vietnam or Afghanistan. This is the ultimate quagmire. By the time the war on poverty in the United States, which was a wholesale experiment and greater redistribution of resources and public programs, the poverty rate was about 15%. Today, it's about 14.5%. We've bumped along between 12 and 15% poverty ever since the beginning of the war on poverty, while spending $22 trillion. Poverty is not, under these circumstances of redistribution and collectivism, at least at a limited scale, getting easier to escape. It might be easier to bear, but we do not have dignity instead of doles. We have doles instead of dignity. And these are our brothers and sisters, to which I object actually serving doles instead of dignity. Why did this happen? Why did this happen to Inez, Kentucky? Why is Inez, Kentucky still one of the most desperate places in the United States? Go there today, which I did in the filming of a documentary, and you'll find that 31% of the adults there are in the workforce. Why? Because industries have moved to more economical locations and natural resources and are in cheaper markets. And that is one of the side costs of capitalism that Professor Wolf is rightly talking about, and he's right to talk about it. So what's the fair verdict so far? I'm trying to create a balanced picture here. Let me quote President Barack Obama. In a conversation that I had with him, he said these words to me. in 2015 at Georgetown University. Quote, "We don't dispute that the free market is the greatest producer of wealth in history. It has lifted billions of people out of poverty. But there has always been trends in the market in which concentrations of wealth can lead some people being left behind." Now, you may be tempted to say that there's only three options out there. Option number one is starving children in Ethiopia. Option number two is lifting people out of poverty in Ethiopia, but people who are desperate in Inez, Kentucky. Those are the two scenarios we're presented with largely today. Or then there's option number three, which is socialism at a greater level, replacing capitalism. I say there's a fourth path, and I want to present it to you in my last few minutes. A fourth path that keeps our treasured free enterprise system that lifts people out of poverty, but it changes philosophy, it changes policy, and it changes culture. We need a philosophical shift, not just if capitalism is going to survive, but whether or not our culture as we currently know it will survive. See, the problem is since the beginning of the war on poverty, where we've had kind of a corporate socialism, semi-quasi-capitalism in the United States, is that we've gone from needing everyone to helping everybody. What I admire about Richard's position is he's saying we need to need everybody because that's the basis of dignity. Read between the lines of what he said, that's what he was saying. Dignity is what matters. Giving people a voice is what matters to give them dignity. Well, we have gone through the welfare system in this country to one in which certain people are needed and other people are simply maintained, managed, like liabilities. That's how we treat poor people in this country. Can capitalism help make that possible? Government can't, and government won't, is my view, or it would have. Can capitalism make a moral shift like this? Well, if you look back to Adam Smith, he certainly said so. We always remember his Wealth of Nations from 1776, The Invisible Hand. That wasn't his first or best book. In 1759, 17 years earlier, he wrote The Theory of Moral